This was once the focus of all creation. Standing at the center of the world, the universe and the mind of God. For 500 years it sheltered a court dedicated to privilege and power. It was built for one man, the Son of Heaven. But it was also a palace and a prison in one. And at the best of times and the worst of times, it was hard to tell them apart. In the end, here was a dynasty expected to last forever until time brought it all to a close. This is the Forbidden City. In the year 1688, a government official from Anhui province arrived in Beijing. His name was Yang Su-yun. He had traveled almost 1,000 miles, a journey of 30 days. The last mile he walked alone, without his servants, without transport. For beyond the gate was the great within, the Forbidden City. We know about Yang's audience because everything that happened inside these gates was obsessively written down and stored. Funeral orations, dinner menus, declarations of war, all here in the Imperial Archive of 50 million manuscripts. This attention to detail was one defining feature of the Forbidden City. Harmony with the universe was another. When that harmony was disturbed, it meant dynasties could collapse. As a young man, Yang had seen the 300-year-old Ming dynasty fall after an eclipse of the sun. His mission now was to report on the latest bad omens. Typhoons off the Cantonese coast, a comet seen above the Gobi Desert. These things spoke of heaven's weariness and a chaos that could end in emperor's rule. When the Forbidden City emerged out of the North China Plain at the start of the 15th century, it was the biggest complex of palaces in the world. It still is. It was designed to reflect the eternal glory of the Ming emperors. 100,000 men built it, and at night their kilns lit up the surrounding plains. 100 million bricks, 200 million tiles, timber from the trees of southern Namu. Trees that took 4 years to get here by river and the Grand Canal. When the work was over, the people vanished, leaving the city to an emperor and the court who served him. Sealed off from the world, it aspired to contain all the cosmos within its walls, a universe within a universe. At the center of this controlled universe, the imperial throne. All power flowed from this room. Around it, a fabled 9,999 rooms. The yellows were for power, the reds for good luck, and everywhere the imperial dragons to bring the rains and make the land prosper. One carving of dragons decorated a single piece of marble so vast that it was transported in winter along a highway of ice. When it was found to be too big, legend has it that the emperor's soldiers whipped the marble until it buckled and moved on. There were 18 provinces in the empire, and intelligence reports and tax ledgers arrived in the Forbidden City every day. An empire of 150 million people, Han Chinese, Mongol, Manchu, was governed from here by the world's oldest and most sophisticated bureaucratic machine. A bureaucrat might cross the entire empire, but he could not cross this wall. Beyond it was the inner court. Other than the emperor himself, the only other people allowed here were his concubines and the castrated eunuchs. There were more eunuchs than anyone else in the Forbidden City. Up to 3,000 orbited around the Son of Heaven like satellites. They were his slaves, although he could not function without them. Every morning they dressed the emperor in one of 1,000 gowns, each ordained for a different season, and most of them imperial yellow. One emperor recalled,
"Whenever I think of my childhood, my head fills with a yellow mist. My sedan chair was yellow, my clothes were yellow, the bowls from which I ate, everything was yellow. This made me feel from my earliest years that I had a heavenly nature."
The Emperor Kangxi ascended the throne in 1661. He was to reign for the next 61 years, the golden age of Chinese imperial rule. Kangxi's mandate, like the mandate for all the emperors, came not from the people, but from the heavens. Each year at sunrise at the winter solstice, that mandate was renewed. The emperor and his entourage left the Forbidden City to travel through the clean and empty streets of Beijing to make the sacrifice and take the vows at the Temple of Heaven. A Chinese philosopher had once written, "If the ruler is correct, then the creative energies will be harmonious and compliant. Winds and rain will be timely, auspicious stars will appear, and then the yellow dragon will descend." The emperor was at the center of the universe. Authority derived from heaven meant that Kangxi, like emperors before him, had absolute power. In his diaries, Kangxi wrote,
"Giving life to people and killing people, those are the powers that the emperor has. He knows that people sometimes must be persuaded into morality by an execution. Although a court audience has the important function of reducing arrogance."
The kowtow literally meant knocking one's head. Kangxi loved to see his generals humbled in this way. The Emperor Kangxi knew that intimidation had its limits. Fearful men might keep information to themselves, and that could be disastrous. Kangxi demanded that his diviners never distort the truth.
10分附图纸，今将京师及各省夜时分秒照列颁行直隶各省一份，救护实行。为此，谨提请旨。好了，朕知道了，我找人去办吧。
Astronomy was an obsession of Kangxi's. It had been since he was an 8-year-old boy. His tutor was the best in China, although he was not Chinese. The Jesuit Ferdinand Verbius was a Westerner and therefore a barbarian, but he was also a brilliant astronomer and therefore valuable to the imperial court. In over 2 centuries, only a handful of Westerners had come this far.
前2天我们说的一个问题，我想了很久，一直想问问你，你怎么比别人更多的知道这些天文规律呢？
皇上，近100年来，欧洲几乎天文学家在深入地研究新的天文规律，我从中也掌握了一些。
When he had come to Beijing from Rome in 1660, Verbius had brought the knowledge of Kepler and Galileo with him. The emperor had Verbius appointed to the board of astronomers. He revolutionized Chinese astronomy. A new observatory was built, and the Westerner began to study the stars for the Son of Heaven.
好，正合适啊，向西转12度啊。 向西12度，明白明白。再向东转2度啊。好的，向东2度，记下来了吗？啊，记下来。
The elevation of Verbius was a dramatic break from the Chinese custom. The intellectual curiosity of Kangxi allowed a point of outside light into the forbidden city, and the emperor was an ardent pupil.
One evening the emperor made me sit down by him and had me name all the constellations that appeared. He himself first named all those he knew already, delighting to show the skill he had in this science.
Astronomy was science, but it was also self-protection. A new calendar was unveiled every fall at the Meridian Gate. For years, the court astronomers had made bad miscalculations. Their inaccuracies led to famine because seed across China had been planted too early or harvested too late. Kangxi's prestige and authority were based on scientific method.
奉天承运，皇帝诏曰。 特颁布康熙40年，实现书于天下。钦此。
Kangxi's calendars were reliable. They strengthened his dynasty. But help from the West would always have its contradictions in the Forbidden City. Perhaps the emperor had elevated outsiders like the Jesuit priest Verbius because he was an outsider himself, a Manchu. In 1644, his family had come at the head of a marauding army from beyond the Great Wall of China. In a matter of days, the ancient and enfeebled Ming dynasty had fallen to the men from the north. The Manchus were skilled horsemen, they were good with arrows, but they were not intellectuals. Fools, said one Han Chinese official, without grace or character. Kangxi, the Manchu emperor of the new Qing dynasty, wanted to change all that. He immersed himself in ancient Chinese history. He developed the mind of a scholar, not a soldier. Not that he could afford to do without soldiers. There were many Chinese who would never accept their new masters. And rebellion was a constant threat in the early years of Kangxi's reign. It took 19 years before the Forbidden City had been properly secured for the Manchu. And then the new order took root. Kangxi's first problem had been the power of the eunuchs. They developed a taste for politics during the Ming dynasty, and nothing seemed to get done without bribing them. Kangxi turned them into servants again. All of the emperor's eunuchs were volunteers. All had been given a last chance to change their minds when the knife came out. Kangxi said that they babbled like babies, but they did guarantee the chastity of his women.
主儿，您的头发又黑又亮，可真好啊！主儿，您看您的耳坠儿是不是换一个呀？
合适。
合适。今儿个皇上见了您，管保龙心大悦。主儿。 待会儿您走路的时候要轻巧一些，要飘洒一些，好像天仙下凡一样才行啊！
Emperor Kangxi had a low opinion of his eunuchs.
They are quite different from ordinary people. They are equivalent to the meanest insects. I keep them working at menial jobs. I ignore their frowns and smiles and make sure that they stay poor. If too much grace is shown, they become uppity.
Instead of politics, for Kangxi, they pressed silk, chased rodents, they kept the flies off dried fruit, and they sang falsetto in the court operas. It was a far cry from what they might have once expected.
I was castrated by my own choice. It seemed a little thing to give up one pleasure for so many. My parents were poor, yet by suffering that small change, I could be sure of an easy life in surroundings of beauty and magnificence. I could aspire to intimate companionship with lovely women, unmarred by their fear or distrust of me. With good fortune and diligence, I might have grown more rich and powerful than some of the greatest officials in the empire. Are we happy? How could that be? We have no wives, no sons to bear us grandsons and sacrifice at our tombs. We dare not ask for happiness.
Some eunuchs, however, must still have been drawn to court intrigue. Otherwise, the following decree would have been unnecessary.
From now on, anyone who is guilty of interfering with government affairs, misappropriating power, accepting bribes shall promptly be put to death by slicing.
No less captive within the Forbidden City were the imperial concubines. In a lifetime, some had only seen the emperor once. But when that emperor died, they were forced to live in rooms around the garden of forgotten favorites for the rest of their days. There was no limit to the number of concubines an emperor might take. The emperor's responsibility to produce another son of heaven had justified the enormous harems kept by Kangxi's predecessors. But Kangxi, believing these to be excessive, reduced his concubines to fewer than 100. To bear the emperor's son was to eliminate the drudgery in their own lives, but not the tedium. The eunuchs who looked after them also stood to benefit if their concubine was chosen. The emperor made his choice after the evening meal. Kangxi always dined alone, and he was always faced with a vast array of food, most of which went untouched. There was lotus root, dragon-headed prawns, fragrant rices, and dried fruits, swallows' nests and braised bear paw, and the palace dish of chicken and broth cooked with wood ear mushroom. Now it was time to choose his concubine for the night, and the time for the eunuchs to try to direct his hand. Each stick represented a concubine, which the eunuchs carefully arranged to help him make the right choice, choose their concubine. If the emperor chose their mistress, they stood to benefit. But with scores of concubines and hundreds of eunuchs vying for his attention, Kangxi had seen every trick. Kangxi impregnated 30 of his concubines. They bore him a total of 56 children. Motherhood for the successful concubine involved a considerable rise in status. She was relieved of all household duties to become a lady of leisure. This was especially true when taking care of a child like Ying Ren, the heir apparent.
娘娘晚安。
吃饭了吗？
吃了。
吃饱了吗？
吃饱了。
那下课吧。
谢谢娘娘。
看你这话说。
The little child was frequently sick in his infancy. Everything was devoted to his survival. For 10 years he struggled with illness, and then Ying Ren, meaning blessed offspring, received an education in the ancient Confucian tradition of the earlier Ming dynasty. The emperor's favorite child was being groomed for power.
I had the wisest handling scholars to instruct him in morality. He studied the book of history and was instructed in the principles of government. Ying Ren I named as heir apparent.
治世仁人，无求生以害人，有杀生以成仁。
30 years later, the father would be ashamed of his son. And Kangxi's reign, so promising at first, was to sour as the seasons passed. For 60 winters, Kangxi had been emperor in the Forbidden City. It had been a time of prosperity, but there was no joy now. The emperor's 60th winter was the most traumatic of his reign. The problem was Ying Ren, his favorite son. It had started with rumors and court intrigue, but soon became an unquestionable fact.
干什么呢？我送铁板，送铁板，摇摆。
By way of a secret intelligence network, the emperor had discovered that his son was unfit to rule. In the winter of 1722, a special message arrived at the gates of the Forbidden City. It contained the worst news yet. Kangxi already knew that his son was cruel and tyrannical. He also knew that he had purchased young boys from the south for his sexual pleasure, and that he had embezzled state funds and stolen tribute meant for his father. Many of the court officials had been intimidated by the emperor's son, which is why the secret intelligence system was necessary. But this latest information, brought by his spies, would be the most distressing of all to the aging emperor. Kangxi, against the weight of imperial tradition, had avoided making a public decision about his successor. The mounting scandal over his favorite son was the sole reason for this delay. In his last years, Kangxi had grown to fear the arrival of the secret yellow dispatches. The dispatch brought to him this winter talked of rebellion instigated by his son, of disloyalty within the palace, and of patricide and an attempt on his own life.
I was never at rest. How was I to let Ying Ren take up his imperial inheritance? He who was so extravagant, so demanding, so interfering. Many years I bore my suffering silently. As I yielded, he remained unchanging in evil. My heart was ash, my hope gone. What would become of the empire I've inherited from my ancestors? The father I had almost never seen was 23 when he died. And I was 8 when they cut my hair and dressed me in full white mourning, and laid my father's corpse behind the 9 dragon curtains of yellow silk in the palace of heavenly purity, while the bells boomed out across the winter city. All men who live must die, and I exhaust my mind for the country's sake and fragment my spirits for the world. I have enjoyed the veneration of the country and the riches of this world. There's nothing I have not experienced. But now that I have reached old age, I cannot rest easy for a moment. Therefore, I regard the whole country as a worn-out sandal, and all the riches as mud and sand. If I can die without there being an outbreak of trouble, my desires will be fulfilled.
The Emperor Kongxi died on the 20th of December, 1722. An empire had to be informed, and the mandate of heaven was passed on. In his last days, Kongxi had acted by disinheriting his treacherous son. Out of the confusion emerged Young Zhen as his successor. Young Zhen stabilized the dynasty, and 13 years later was duly succeeded by his heir, who ascended the throne as Qianlong, lasting eminence. This time the succession was smooth.
In the first year of his reign, my father wrote my name and placed it in a sealed casket in the main hall of the palace. When he departed on his distant journey, I reverently opened the casket in the presence of his ministers, and we found the mandate which appointed me to the throne.
Qianlong was an emperor in the old Manchu tradition. By training and temperament, he was a hunter. It was during Qianlong's reign that the empire reached its zenith. The emperor still had the mandate of heaven, but now he possessed an aggressive army too. Burma, Annam, Siam, Korea all came to acknowledge Qing supremacy. Life in Qianlong's forbidden city was much the same as Kongxi's time 100 years before. It was still isolated and cut off from the world, but still the fixed point in the revolving firmament. Still the central kingdom in all the world. But in Europe, new and mighty empires were rising with imperial ambitions of their own. To Western eyes, China looked imposing but obsolete.
The Empire of China is an old, crazy man-of-war, which a fortunate succession of officers has managed to keep afloat, and to overawe her neighbors merely by her bulk and her appearances. One day, she will be dashed to pieces on the shore.
Within the Forbidden City, those beyond China's borders were still known as the barbarians. For 200 years, the most familiar barbarians at the imperial court had been Jesuit priests. Sometimes they had been distrusted, but never feared. But towards the end of his reign, Emperor Qianlong would be faced by another type of barbarian. One more naked in its ambition to open China up. This was the British East India Company. To these men, China in the 18th century was a vast untapped market, a potential source of fantastic profits. That the market remained closed to the Western trade was a blow to the pride and the pocket of the British. In the summer of 1793, Qianlong was informed that the British were heading towards Beijing. Their mission, to negotiate a treaty with the emperor to allow British traders free access to China. The ambassador sent by King George III was Lord Macartney, Although China was familiar with foreign envoys, an embassy from such a distant and demanding power set a new precedent for the Dragon Throne.
When dealing with barbarians, one ought to strike the mean between being too lavish or too frugal. When the English tribute envoy arrives, he should not be classed as low as Burma or Annam, which pay tribute every year.
That was the least that Macartney wanted, and he let it be known that he would not be kowtowing. Protocol. Two arrogant empires had to find a way of saying hello to each other without causing offense, but without losing face. At the first brief meeting, a compromise was reached. Before Qianlong, Macartney offered to kneel as he would to his own king. But that's all. The squabbles over protocol did not bode well for the main meeting in Beijing. Macartney was awakened from sleep and summoned for his one and only visit to the Forbidden City.
I cannot ever recall receiving an unpleasanter message in my life. I got up and hurried to the Forbidden City. After a 3-hour wait, we were ushered into the courtyard to meet He Shen, the Emperor's Grand Kalau, or Prime Minister. There before us was the Emperor's fine yellow silk armchair, upon which rested a scroll.
As agreed, Macartney did not kowtow to the emperor. He bowed to the throne and a piece of paper. Qianlong's scroll contained a haughty dismissal.
The virtue and power of the Celestial dynasty has penetrated afar to the myriad kingdoms which have come to render homage, and so all kinds of precious things have been collected here. Nevertheless, we have never valued ingenious articles, nor do we have the slightest need of your country's manufactures. You, O king, should simply act in conformity with our wishes by strengthening your loyalty and swearing perpetual obedience so as to ensure that your country may share the blessings of peace.
7 years later, Qianlong died, but the idea of trade was still unsettled. British demand for Chinese goods, porcelain, silk, and tea increased massively, but Britain was reluctant to hand over silver to get them. Finally, Britain found a commodity that China would take: opium. Imported from India. Just a few chests at first, and then thousands. When the Chinese authorities tried to stop the opium trade, the British sent in their gunboats. After nearly 20 years of turmoil, the Treaty of Tianjin in 1858 not only allowed opium to be imported, but handed over China's ports and all her international trade to Western control. After the war, opium poured into China on an even greater scale, and her emperors were powerless to stop it. The fury of the Dragon Throne was now a pale imitation of what it had been in the past. But the response was to retreat further behind the walls of the Forbidden City and pretend that nothing had changed. The notorious Dowager Empress Cixi personified this flight from reality. In the 1880s, the Forbidden City was practically hers. At 16, she had been a lowly concubine to the emperor. When the emperor died, Cixi organized a coup and installed her 6-year-old son on the Dragon Throne. It was a cynical but brilliant maneuver, for when he grew up, Tongji had a complete lack of interest in the government, preferring self-indulgence to state administration. But pretenses were kept up. Officials would come here to the Hall of Mental Cultivation for audiences with the teenage emperor. Inside the hall, on the imperial throne, sat Tongji. It was to him that the court officials presented the dispatches, in the full knowledge that the real power was literally behind the throne. Though invisible, masked by the silk curtain, it was the Dowager Empress Cixi who ruled the empire.
I have often thought that I am the cleverest woman who ever lived, and that others cannot compare with me. I have heard much about Queen Victoria, but her life is not half as interesting as mine. Now look at me. I have 400 million people all dependent on my judgment.
It was an empty boast. In fact, the Dragon Throne had become isolated and decadent. When the young emperor died of smallpox, the Empress Dowager arranged the death of his pregnant wife soon after. Then she placed her nephew, another child, on the Dragon Throne. Cixi continued to pull the strings from behind the silk curtain. It was scarcely a victory. To control the Forbidden City no longer meant to control China. Court life in the time of the Empress Dowager was, on the face of it, the same as it had always been in the Forbidden City. Elaborate operas were still staged by the eunuchs and still enjoyed by those around the Dragon Throne. But such adherence to ritual masked the problems of the Chinese Empire. Problems Cixi refused to address. As the 19th century drew to a close, rebellion and riots erupted across the nation. But this was not just another peasants' revolt. It was the uprising of the Boxers. This was the name given to the starving peasants who wanted to purge the empire of the Western barbarians. Their rebellion produced a bloodbath. Reprisals were severe when troops from the West arrived in force. The confusion spread to Beijing, and in a panic, the imperial family fled the Forbidden City. Western soldiers entered its gates, and for the first time, outsiders stood uninvited at the Dragon Throne and stayed. Cixi returned, shamefaced, to become a lodger and a curio in her own palace. After years of pulling the strings, she became the puppet, kept in place by the grace of the barbarians. After she died, the last emperor took his place on the Dragon Throne, a 3-year-old Pu Yi.
When they carried me into the Hall of Supreme Harmony and put me onto the high and enormous throne, I could bear it no longer. They told me not to fidget, but I struggled and cried. I don't like it here. I want to go home. As the officials went on kowtowing to me, my cries grew louder and louder. My father tried to soothe me by saying, "Don't cry, don't cry. It will soon be finished. It will soon be finished."
3 years later, a popular uprising swept through China, and the imperium that was meant to last an eternity came to an end. On the 12th of February, the emperor, the last emperor, abdicated the throne. The new Republican government allowed Puyi and his small household staff to remain in the inner court until 1924. In 1925, the Son of Heaven was evicted, and like China, his life entered a period of bewildering change. Gone forever were the 1,000 yellow robes. In 1949, after the founding of the People's Republic of China, the last emperor returned to his homeland where for 10 years he was re-educated. He ended his days as a gardener in Beijing. The ashes of Puyi, the last emperor, lie in the Baobao Shen Cemetery. Nothing here evokes the drama of his life or the glory of imperial China. The same could never be said of the resting places of the other emperors. In death, as in life, they are surrounded by magnificence. Today, the gates are open and mortals walk where they once were forbidden. The hall where the heart is nourished, the palace of gathering elegance, the gate of heavenly peace. These are the earthly remains of a culture centered on ideas. Ideas granted eternal expression in majestic architecture, the subtlest of art, and a society deeply concerned with science and language. These are haunted places, haunted not only by ghosts of the past, but shadows of a paradise lost. These bricks, these walls, these lives, they are not gone. They live.